Good day, this is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you for Reason to Resist from Montreal, Canada on February 27th, 2026. This week, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi disgraced himself by becoming the first Indian Prime Minister to deliver a speech in Israel's House of War Criminals, otherwise known as the Knesset.
Hold firmly that Israel is their fatherland and India their motherland. We are democracies shaped by history and focus on the future. Our partnership is grounded in shared experience and shared aspirations. Our strong partnership not only serves national interests, but also contributes to global stability and prosperity.
That's all I can stand. If these two so-called democracies are the motherland and the fatherland, I think that means that they're married. Now, at the end of this love fest, the Speaker of the Knesset conferred a medal upon Modi, which I have described on X as the gold medal of depravity. The timing of Modi's trip to Israel was eye-popping, to say the least. Trump and Netanyahu are threatening yet another war of aggression against Iran, and the U.S. has, as everybody knows, sent a huge amount of military assets to the region. And also, despite Trump's claim that there's a ceasefire in Gaza, Israel continues to commit genocide in both the occupied Gaza Strip and the occupied West Bank, with the full-throated support of U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, who, by the way, just told Tucker Carlson that Israel should take it all. In other words, Greater Israel, parts of Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, you name it. So that is the backdrop to Modi's historic trip to Israel, in which he was the first Indian Prime Minister to deliver a speech in the Knesset. Now here to help us unpack these developments is John Helmer, our good friend. John is the longest continuously serving foreign correspondent in Russia and the only Western journalist to direct his own Bureau Independent of National Commercial Ties. He has published several books on military and political topics, one of which will be relevant to our discussion today. It's called Long Live Novichok, the British Poison Which Fooled the World. Thank you very much for coming back onto our program, my friend.
Thank you for having me, Dimitri. Good to be back.
So before we begin, I just want to remind our audience, John, if they find this video to be informative, please like and share it. And if you're not already a subscriber to Reason to Resist, please become one. We're rapidly approaching 130,000 subscribers and are looking always for ways to expand the reach of our resistance journalism. So, John, during Modi's trip to Israel, Netanyahu waxed lyrical about something he described as the hexagon alliance.
Yes.
He discussed this supposed alliance as a new regional bloc while framing the Middle East as being divided into radical Sunni and Shia axes. The hexagon apparently includes not only Israel and India, but Greece and Cyprus,
Correct.
and other unnamed Arab, African, and Asian states. This is what we are led to understand. He said together they would unite to collectively stand against what he called radical adversaries. So why don't we start with just the big picture, John? Why do you think Modi went to Israel at this particular time, and in such a flamboyant manner, I should add?
That's the big question, and it's with great sadness that I'm speaking in answer to the question, because I have both Indian friends, Indian sources, and no one in India, so far as I can tell, gives an answer to that question. First, the only significant Indian opposition to Prime Minister Modi's visit and the way he expressed himself, so there are two different things there, is the Kerala Communist Party. The Kerala state it has a Communist Party government, and they're the only ones to have gone public in criticism. The offshore Indians in the Indian diaspora, there have been a number of Indian voices that have made credible, critical reviews, but no one seems willing to be as well informed enough about the Modi circle in Delhi to explain why he chose the timing, why he chose the visit now, because back in December, the timing of the Red Fort attack, the terrorist attack in Delhi, was the reason why a visit with Prime Minister Netanyahu was put off. So if the timing then was adverse, the timing now on the brink of an Israeli-American war, as you've just said, against Iran, is odious and imminent and odious. It attracts Indian support and endorsement for such a new war. So what we have here, I think, and we can pull the pieces out, is a confusion on the part of the Modi administration between operational necessities as they see it. I can hear objectors in the audience who misunderstand what I'm saying between what I'm reporting as Indian views and what are attributed as my views. Let's just stick to what I'm trying to report. There is a confusion, and it produces a colossal blunder in this case on the Indian side between the operational necessities for India in defending itself now and in the future against its enemies, the strategy for India as an aspiring and growing superpower, and the ideology that comes with these aspirations and the economic base that India is building outwards in the rest of the world. I'll get into the operations, the strategy, and the ideology in a minute. If you look at the 40, let me turning to look at my side at my notes, there are 42 points in the Indian-Israel joint statement, all relating to areas of cooperation, areas of development, from AI to defense, to agriculture, to irrigation, to labor mobility. There will be proposed increase in Indian workers in Israel, replacing Palestinian ones, from 20,000 to 50,000. 42 points, all of which could have been agreed without Prime Minister Modi's visit to Israel and without the speech in the Knesset. We'll come back to the speech in a minute. So why was it decided now? The best I can assemble for the answer to your question is that the foreign minister, Mr. Jaishankar, S. Jaishankar, has persuaded Prime Minister Modi that for both operational and strategic necessity on India's part, it's necessary to curry favor or recruit Israeli support, which means Jewish lobby support with the United States, in order to mitigate adverse Trump policy on trade with India, with an Indian-US trade agreement coming up first. Second, to mitigate the amount of damage that Trump is doing to Indian aspirations for the Indian diaspora, for Indian access to the American market as for visas, and the long-term perception that US reorientation towards Pakistan includes not only increased Pakistani threat to India, but increased US operations inside India for splitting, for dividing, for regime change, for backing the Rahul Gandhi Congress Party and other things. In other words, and it's old-fashioned, India, around Mr. Modi, the Indian bureaucracy, the Indian advisory staffs have bought the old idea that the best way to manipulate and persuade the United States government towards you is to build an alliance with a Jewish lobby. That appears to have been Jaishankar's particular contribution. Second, in the coming weeks, months, and years, the Modi administration is going to decide whether to formally, militarily, economically absorb Kashmir. And there are a number of arguments in the Indian press and among my colleagues that India wants and will need to absorb Kashmir, drive Pakistan, end Pakistani influence in Kashmir, administration of Kashmir, end the partition of Kashmir, and needs fundamental US support for that move. If that were to happen, and I can be corrected on it, we're talking about the future. We're talking about future strategy for Indian security. The calculation is that India must have US support, and the way to achieve that, among other things, is to build a Jewish lobby relationship in Washington. So, whereas you could say, because I'm saying it, that that the operational necessities for this visit aren't significant, didn't really weigh on Modi's decision to go and to speak as he did in the Knesset, the longer-term Indian strategy does require, they think, neutralizing US hostility and planning for internal splitting operations inside India, building up Bangladesh as an Indian enemy, and so on, and building up the Jewish lobby alliance for that purpose. That's a line that isn't discussed or even discussable in the Indian press. As to the issue of the so-called hexagon alliance, this is basically a trap. What you see in India is a country, is an economy, a political economy, which is, and I'm looking at my notes so I get the numbers right, a political economy which depends on exports. Right now, India has reduced the percentage of its GDP that is represented by export of goods and services from about 120% of GDP down to about 70%. Okay. This is an improvement, but India is so dependent on exports of goods. It's far more dependent on sea lanes for shipping those goods outwards and for maximizing market demand for those exports abroad. Compare Russia, Russian exports represent only about 22% of its GDP. The USA exports represent only about 11% of GDP. China, 20% of GDP. So in the long-term calculation for the Indian political economy, two things have to happen. More diversification and building up of domestic demand, requiring investment in India, first. Second, more security for India's outward trade. For outward trade, there's a paradox. On the one hand, you see India in the last few weeks develop alternatives to the US trade because Trump has represented a significant threat to cut off Indian trade into the US market. So India's signed a very significant trade agreement with Europe. To get to Europe, which is what this so-called hexagon alliance means, the Indian word for it is India, Middle East, Europe corridor, IMEC corridor. This requires the building in the Indian calculation of, let's call it, shore alliances with the UAE, recently signed with the UAE bin Zayed family, with the Israel ports in which there's heavy Indian investment. Haifa, for example, is 70% owned by Indian investors. And going into the Mediterranean northwards to Cyprus, to Greece, and on to Europe. IMEC corridor represents for India an alternative that would preclude the closure of choke points and hostile action by the US at one end, or powers seeking to cut off India's trade with Russia at another end. The paradox here is that India is so oil dependent. The last set of numbers I saw were that India depends on imported oil for nearly 90% of its oil needs, of which 45% of its imported oil comes presently. I'm getting the numbers a bit muddled. The leading oil exporter to India has been Russia.
Can we pause there, John? Because I
Sure.
want to hone in on this whole question of oil. So, quite apart from, India's going to Israel, its prime minister, on the eve of what is probably going to be another war of aggression on Iran, led by Israel and the United States. It was reported last week that India, its Coast Guard, seized tankers that were suspected of quote unquote smuggling Iranian oil. Now, it's only smuggling if you consider the US or Western sanctions on Iranian oil to be legitimate and legal. They're not.
Yes.
But quite apart from that, the three oil tankers, you can see one of these reports up on the screen there. They were the MT Asphalt Star, the MT Al Jazeera, and the MT Stella Ruby. And 9 people, this report says, were booked as the probe continues. I think booked means they were charged with some kind of offense.
Yes.
Now, quite apart from that, John, there have been, it's quite unclear exactly what's going on with India's purchases of Russian oil. But there was this report today, sorry, wrong report. This report was published today in the South China Morning Post, and its title is India in Limbo Over Russian Oil Imports as Talks with US on Trade Deal Continues. As you can see there, it says that India was previously buying up to 2 million barrels of Russian oil per day. Indian refiners would likely import about 1.2 million barrels of Russian crude a day in February, the lowest level since November 2022. And it's projected by an expert in the oil industry that the level would fall to 800,000 to 1 million barrels a day in March. And at the bottom here, it says, in February, Saudi Arabia is expected to emerge as India's top oil supplier, overtaking Russia, with shipments averaging between 1 million and 1.13 million barrels per day. Now, in late breaking news, and by the way, as you know, John, I often say that generally things don't happen. The timing of things in international affairs is generally not random. Sometimes, of course, there are random occurrences that can have dramatic impacts on the course of events. But right after Modi left Israel, Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, gets on a plane and goes to India, literally the day after, to reset relations between Canada and India. It's been quite hostile for some time for a variety of reasons I won't get into. Now, I know there are a lot of Canadians who cling to this delusion that Prime Minister Goldman Sachs is standing up to the United States, but I think there are lots of indications that he continues to be extraordinarily deferential to Washington. And I suspect that he would not have gone to India to reset relations if he thought that was going to alienate the Trump regime. So he gets to India, and what happens? India's prime minister says, we are willing to buy whatever Canada is offering in connection with Canada's oil, natural gas, and uranium. So there's a lot to unpack here, John. You know, if I were the United States government and I wanted to divide BRICS, which is clearly something that the Trump regime and any U.S. administration would want to do, I would think that of the major BRICS players, the one that is most likely to be peeled off is India. And India now, it seems, is diminishing its purchases of Russian oil. It's intercepting Iranian oil tankers or tankers suspected of, quote unquote, smuggling Iranian oil, even though the major buyer of Iranian oil is China, you know, this major BRICS country. You know, China and Russia have to some degree aligned themselves with Iran in the conflict against with Israel and the United States. India is doing the opposite of that. When I look at all of this, what I see, and of course, there's India cozying up to Canada, which remains intensely hostile to Russia and to a lesser degree to China's government as well. When I add it all up, it looks to me like Modi is, I won't say abandoning the BRICS. I think that's going too far. But he does seem to be, you know, distancing India, his government, from the BRICS, and certainly behaving in ways that is likely to create some friction. And the last thing I'll point out here is, you know, Iran recently became a member of BRICS. So how is this consistent with the claim that India is firmly ensconced within the BRICS and the new multipolar order and all of that stuff we've been talking about for so long?
It isn't consistent. There are paradoxes and there are contradictions. Let me go back to a point that's immensely paradoxical, let's say. If India reduces its purchases of Russian oil, which for the time being it's doing, then it becomes more dependent, not simply on Arab supplies of oil, but more dependent on keeping the Strait of Hormuz open. Roughly speaking, half of all Indian oil must come through an open Strait of Hormuz. UAE and Saudi Arabia become the principal suppliers of Indian oil, minor amounts from Kuwait, a significant amount from Iraq. How can India support, by silent endorsement, as we've already indicated, an Israeli-American attack on Iran, if that will close the Strait of Hormuz and cut off India from its 3 Arab suppliers of oil? Iran used to be a major supplier of crude oil to India. Under sanctions pressure, India has stopped buying Iranian oil. The vessels you displayed there were carrying petroleum products. Unfortunately, I'm unprepared for the question. I've got the notes on what my Indian sources have explained to me was the reason why those 3 tankers were intercepted offshore for a charge of smuggling. Nobody's been able to explain to me why they weren't arrested when the petroleum products were offloaded onshore in India. That's when the offense would have been committed, right? A smuggling offense is committed when you actually cross a border, not when you're in the economic zone, not when you're outside territorial waters. This is a mystery to me. I haven't got my notes in front of me to help explain it, but it appears also to be less in relation to either Iran as the source of the products or the flags of the vessels, one of which was a Russian flag vessel, I understand, and much more to do with onshore Indian business competition. But I can't add any more. That's a red herring for our bigger discussion here. We started with the idea that India, as export dependent, must have both operationally and strategically new relations to guard its trade outwards and protect itself against choke points in the east, Strait of Malacca, in the west, Strait of Hormuz, Bab el-Mandab, the Suez Canal, the Mediterranean. It's doing that with Israel at the same time as it threatens its own access to oil through the Strait of Hormuz. If anyone in the audience can explain to me and to us that contradiction strategically and operationally, let's hear it. But in my view,
I just want to add,
yes.
In addition, seizing Iranian oil tankers, especially if they were in international waters, it undermines the principle of freedom of navigation. And one would think that a country that is so dependent upon maritime transportation of trade would be very concerned to uphold the principle of freedom of navigation. So I mean, I can't make sense of any of this, John. Sorry.
Well, no, I think there's a way of making sense. In politics, there are factions that fight each other, that pursue different policies, and heads of government, heads of state, try to accommodate multiple factions. Prime Minister Modi is no better at that than President Putin. Okay, and what emerges looks profoundly contradictory. Yes. Why is such a contradiction possible? Because different factions within a government push, let's say, contradictory or opposing lines. I don't want to ignore Prime Minister Carney's visit, but let's come to that's relatively smaller in scale. It definitely represents an Indian calculation that Carney will relax the hostility that was characteristic of Chrystia Freeland and Justin Trudeau, and will stop and will be more cooperative on the problem of Sikh terrorism in Canada. Okay, so that's parenthetical, but it reflects that each time India is making moves, it's acting in pursuit of its own operational necessities. But let's go back to the bigger points you're making. Does India, in fact, destroy its capacity as leader this year, chairman of the BRICS this year, when it makes these series of operational and strategic choices in its own interest? Nobody is saying that states, countries, political parties should act contrary to their perceived national interests. Then one has arguments about what's the national interest. But however, from an Indian point of view, and I was in Delhi just before the Putin visit in December, the question was often put to me from a BRICS point of view: how can India trust President Putin if there's a conflict between India and China? Which way, the Indians asked me, will Putin orient Russian policy towards China in a conflict with India, or towards India, bearing in mind that there's a long-standing Russian strategic military relationship with India? The problem from an Indian point of view is that it now sees each of the significant powers in BRICS, China, Russia, itself, and other states, cutting their own deal with President Trump to save their trade, their outgoing export, their investment possibilities, to protect their fleets from sanctions, from secondary sanctions. So if India sees, for example, President Putin through Kirill Dmitriev proposing re-dollarization of Russian trade, that runs strictly, obviously, massively against the BRICS attempt to find alternative payment systems. If India sees that, it says, if Russia's going to cut its own deal contrary to the BRICS goals with Trump for its national interest, why shouldn't India do the same in pursuit of its national interest? Now, everyone sees but doesn't discuss the internal problems President Xi has in China now, so that it's unclear exactly what kinds of external policies, priorities the Chinese government will make after this internal disturbance between the military leadership, the Politburo, the Communist Party leadership, and President Xi's personal circle going forward. So if in a world in which the pillars of BRICS or foundation stones of BRICS are suspect that their better interest is in cutting a US deal contrary to their prior BRICS commitments, they will all come apart. And what will happen is what an Indian colleague of mine has called de-hyphenated discussions. He has described Prime Minister Modi's trip to Israel as de-hyphenating India's prior policies of supporting peace with Iran, not war, peace with Palestine, not genocide. You can't de-hyphenate genocide. Genocide is a very new phenomenon, and Prime Minister Modi intentionally avoided referring to it. Instead, what one has, and now we get into the area of how oddly the ideology of the pursuit of national interest on the Indian side, on the Russian side, the US side, the Chinese side, and so forth, how the ideology of national future creates other contradictions. And so if you don't mind, I'll wander a little further away from the point to make something that's central here, in my view. What Prime Minister Modi did in that speech in the Knesset was to say that religion and nationality define each other. Now, if you do that, and leaving aside Hinduism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, leaving aside the particulars, once the leader of a state defines the ideology of his state, the national ideology in religious terms, and that's what Modi did with respect to India, and said it was the same thing as what the Israelis do in their state. Once religion and nationality are equalized, as Modi said it was between India and Israel, you have theocratic fascism coming up really quickly. You have doctrines of religious supremacism, doctrines of religious motivated racism. You have crusader mentality. Now,
just pause there. I agree with all that, but in terms of what that conception of nationality results in, I completely agree with you. But as I don't know if you had the opportunity to watch Tucker Carlson's excellent takedown of Mike Huckabee, but Tucker Carlson tried to get Huckabee to explain why, quote unquote, Jews have a right to emigrate to Israel and others don't. And at various points in their conversation, Huckabee didn't want to be pinned down. At some points he was saying, well, it's genetic. You know, if you prove that you are of Jewish lineage, of Jewish ethnicity, then you have a right to come here. And then at other points, he said it's religion. And, you know, in the course of that discussion, Tucker Carlson pointed out to him that some of the most influential Zionists since the creation of Israel were atheists. I believe Ben Gurion was an atheist. And he also pointed out that Netanyahu, for all of his talk about Jewish religion, is essentially secular. There are a lot of people in Israeli society, even today, who aren't particularly devout Jews or even outright atheists. So whatever his conception of nationality may be, I would suggest that it doesn't actually reflect the reality of Israel. I'm not going to comment on whether it reflects the reality of India, other than to say that a very significant proportion of the population in India are practicing and devout Muslims, as you well know, John. So,
well, it's a significant minority. Let's be clear. It's 15%. It's a significant minority. But I think we would be wasting our audience's brains to discuss anything said by Mr. Huckabee. And nor should Americans dictate the terms in which we discuss this bigger issue.
I was simply commenting on the fact that Israel is not, in fact, a religious state.
Isn't it? That's not true. It certainly is. Its constitution defines itself, and its religion defines its nationality. I would have thought it is a constitutionally theocratic state.
In theory, but in practice, as I mentioned, the only reason why I raised Huckabee is because Carlson, made a very powerful point when he said that in the history of Israel, numerous of the most powerful figures were atheists, and this remains true today. So whatever the theory may be, in actual practice, Israel does not ascribe to the view that you have to be a devout Jew from a religious perspective to be a citizen of the state, a loyal citizen of the state, a contributor to the state, or even a very, very powerful citizen of Israel. So it doesn't exclude from the power structures of Israel or from citizenship people, Jews who do not practice Judaism. That's the reality. So whatever it may say in the Constitution, that's the simple point that I was trying to make. And, the same obviously is true of India. Whatever Modi's conception of India may be in theory, as you said, 15% of the population are devout Muslims. And I'm sure that there's a significant percentage of the population that are neither Hindu nor Muslim in India. So
let's put it this way. They're certainly not Jewish. And this was a very peculiar thing for Prime Minister Modi to reflect on. He made a point of talking about the Jewish community in India, referring to the 2,000-year history of Jewish communities, mainly on the west coast of India. He forgot to mention, he deliberately didn't mention, that the Jewish community peaked at approximately 40,000 in the 1940s. In the 1940s, Jewish population of India peaked at 20,000, and most of them migrated to Israel since then. So most Indian Jews, of a tiny, tiny minority in India, left India, so that the population now of Jews in India is less than 5,000. Why one would emphasize such a small group makes no sense at all, unless you're trying to say that Jewish religion and nationality are like Hindu religion and nationality, and they define a common approach to national ideology. That's seriously, provocative for the future. It's provocative in the Middle East. It's provocative inside India. Why did Prime Minister Modi say that? That I can't explain, but because it doesn't relate at all to this, let's call it the political strategic calculation, that to make India's future more secure and better supplied on the US side, less threatened by the US, you need Jewish allies, Jewish lobby allies, not simply Israelis.
I take it he didn't mention, John, that there are approximately twice as many Jews in Iran as there are in India. Right. So I just want to clarify one thing. I'm sorry to interrupt before you continue, because you've used the phrase Jewish lobby several times. As I'm sure you would acknowledge, there are a significant number of Jews living in the United States and other parts of the Jewish population in the world who would share my sentiment of being appalled at Modi's appearance in the Knesset. However, so I take it when you're referring to the Jewish lobby, you are referring to the Zionist Jewish lobby, not the anti-Zionist Jewish population. Would that be fair?
I'll just leave you say it the way you said it. I'm not going to discuss. I've talked about Jewish identity in the past. I've talked about the connection between Jewish identity, Jewish theory, Jewish doctrine, Israeli nationality, and now isn't the time to talk about it. Okay. But now isn't the time to talk about it. And as for the Jewish opposition to the genocide, while respecting that there are Jews who accept and oppose this, it's not relevant. It's small. It doesn't count politically.
Okay, I guess my only point is that groups like AIPAC, which undoubtedly would be ecstatic about Modi's visit to Israel, they don't represent in any meaningful sense a significant segment. I agree with you. It's based upon polling that I've seen, it's a minority of the Jewish population, but nonetheless, it doesn't represent that minority. These lobby groups in the United States, which will be, over the moon about this trip. In any case, we don't need to debate that. I thought it was just important to point out that distinction. And let's go back then to these paradoxes, these contradictions you were referring to. You talked about the Russians cutting their own deal with the United States. I mean, they actually haven't cut any deal yet. You and I have had a bit of an exchange offline about what is actually going on in these negotiations. And yes, you've talked about, Kirill Dmitriev in your writings and in our personal conversations, and this segment of the Russian political elite that seems favorable to the idea of reestablishing economic ties with the West, and particularly the United States, and the re-dollarization and so forth. But at this stage, they haven't cut any such deal. There is no deal. In effect, the war rages on. There's been really no de-intensification of the conflict. And I suspect that there are people within the Russian political elite who don't want to go down that path. So India at this stage, I think really doesn't know where all of that's going to go. And quite apart from that, Russia has a particular concern that India doesn't have, and that is that Russia is waging a war against effectively the entirety of NATO, which has been going on now for more than 4 years. So India doesn't have to deal with that problem. Insofar as it has some issues with China, they pale in comparison to Russia's problems with NATO. And, the easy way to dispense with the whole question of, whose side would Russia take in a conflict between China and India is for China and India to resolve their relatively limited differences.
Well, wait a minute. The Indian side doesn't think they're relatively limited.
Well, they're certainly limited, John.
Wait a minute.
Just compare.
Wait a minute. You said relatively limited. That's a judgment. Neither side thinks that.
No, but John, I'm asking you what you think. Are you telling me that India's conflicts with China are comparable to the Russian war with NATO?
Of course not.
Okay, well, that's all I'm saying. No. It's not the same thing. It's not even in the same league. There is no war.
There's no point in comparing apples and oranges here. We're talking about the perception from the Indian side, the perception from the Chinese side. Yes, it would be far better if they were able to resolve their conflicts, which have led to military clashes. Yes, they are far smaller in significance, in casualties, than the Russian war on the Ukraine battlefield. But no, they're not insignificant to either side, strategically speaking.
Okay. If I sounded like I was saying they're insignificant to them strategically.
No, you said relatively minor, and that's the point I'm trying to say.
and we don't need to debate this any further. I'm not saying that these are insignificant issues to China and India. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that Russia is in a quite different position from India. When you compare what's going on with NATO to what has happened between India and China, it's in a what's going on is much more dangerous to Russian survival, frankly. So please let's get back to the question at hand. And what I want to focus on in the time remaining to us is, what do you think all of this means for BRICS?
It's death. It's finito. It's not going to be an alliance. It's going to be as transactional as each of the states seek to protect themselves from American threats in the pursuit of their own interest. It's not a significant foundation of multipolarity. It's not the significant rival to US hegemony or US imperialism that maybe all of us had hoped for, that resistance journalism stands for. But to the extent that presently the pillars of BRICS, Russia, China, and India are pursuing very significant directions and reluctant to see BRICS in the ways in which the propaganda of BRICS has portrayed the combination. I would say that this action by Prime Minister Modi terminates the trust BRICS members would have towards India for the basic elements of BRICS, let's call it alliance. If you'd like to spell out what you see as the BRICS of BRICS, the building blocks, then we could say, do we think the BRICS members, and you mentioned Iran as one of them, have any reason to trust India, or India any reason to trust them going forward?
Not with Modi at the head of that government. I think Modi has, I agree with you, John. I think Modi has delivered what could very well be a death blow to BRICS, at least the way many in the alternative media have conceived of BRICS. Okay,
that's an important point. Yes.
Yeah. So to me, it's inconceivable at this stage that if the Indian government remains on this path and continues to deal with Israel and Western countries, the United States in particular, in this manner, that BRICS has any hope of becoming what many of us wanted it to be. And I share your views about this 100%.
Let's be fair. We're not disagreeing here. And I know many in our audience want to disagree from a Pakistani perspective or from an Indian perspective. Let's at least agree what the method here is of answering the questions we're discussing. The method is evidence in each of the political structures we're talking about, evidence in their economic base, where the money goes, where the votes go, where the bullets go, where the arms relationships are built. It's the evidence that we're looking at here. And I think we started by saying how to interpret the clips that you showed of Prime Minister Modi saying the things he said. I've got the speech in front of me. I really recommend it's difficult. It's more difficult to watch it being said than to read it, but it makes some profound new points for India in the past. And we have to understand the past isn't the now. Genocide changes everything. In the past, India tried to balance its relations between the Arab states within the inter-Arab politics. And I've quoted Muammar Gaddafi's advice to India in the last Dances with Bears piece. Okay,
Could you
where
please share that with us? What was the advice?
Well, he made it. I mean, he invited an Indian delegation, both Muslim, Hindu, and other. They met in Sirte, which is in the southern Libyan desert. And the date is approximate. It's 10 years before Gaddafi was murdered. And he basically laid out that US and Israeli imperialism as a partnership will always aim to destroy India's growth and expansion and development as a sovereign state, and will mobilize conflict between Pakistan and India, between India and Bangladesh, between India and China, to further damage and neuter and hobble the evolution of India as a state. That's what he told them. I don't have any doubt that he's right. The question isn't my opinion here. The question is, what's the evidence that Indian advisors around Prime Minister Modi, the Indian military planning the future defense of the country, differ or agree with Gaddafi's analysis? Indian, analysis of US imperialism. What's that now? What's the evidence that Prime Minister Modi has a view on the dangers to India of US imperialism of the kind Gaddafi explained? What's Prime Minister Modi's and his circle's view about how an alliance with the UAE, as signed with Tahnoun and Mohammed bin Zayed recently, benefits the balance that India has tried to strike between Saudi Arabia and the UAE? Is India's capability to understand Arab politics being destroyed by the commitment to a Jewish lobby, US-Israeli alliance of the kind that Prime Minister Modi spelled out? All of these are questions for which there's either evidence or there's no evidence. It's not exactly your opinion or my opinion. If folks want to listen to us and watch the movement of our mouths, they've got to understand that resistance journalism is still evidence-based journalism. Okay? The resistance part starts with the questions we ask and the methods we use to analyze and give an answer. Not because we love watching our own mouths wagging. It's because this is the truth of the matter.
100%. Couldn't agree more. So this has been a most fascinating discussion, at the same time quite dispiriting.
Awkward. It's awkward because this is a very significant and new phenomenon. And take a look around the world of alt media, who's discussing it. It's as if India doesn't bloody well exist. Excuse me. What sort of a mentality is that?
I think this is a political earthquake, what Modi did, and all the other things we've been talking about that are going on in the background of Indian foreign policy. And I hope people, in the anti-imperialist movement,
yes,
they think very hard about what this all means, in a realistic manner, rather than idealizing the BRICS as some kind of force that's going to save us all. If there's one thing that I want our resistance journalism to communicate to our audience, is that ultimately we have to rely upon ourselves to save ourselves from the depravity of Western elites. We can't really count on any foreign act or even agglomeration of states like BRICS to come to our aid. Hopefully they will, and they may be able to assist in certain ways, but ultimately our freedom depends upon our own efforts. So I hope that message has become more clear to people in the anti-imperialist movement over the last few days.
And sometimes you have to go to bed feeling miserable and sad. And sometimes you get up in the morning feeling miserable and sad. You don't watch podcasts to feel happy.
Well, I hope we at least bring a smile to the faces of our viewers.
If folks want me to make jokes, okay, make jokes. This
Well,
isn't.
on that though, let's talk about something hilarious. Just to, there, as you're all too aware, during the Munich Security Conference, the governments of the UK, Germany, France, the Netherlands, and I think it was Sweden, some other Washington lapdog. Sweden,
Sweden, the Netherlands, France, Germany,
right,
and the United Kingdom, the big five.
yes.
Or
So
the little five.
the big five came out with a statement, a joint statement, that laboratory tests, which as far as I know have not been actually published, we don't even know who did them, showed that Alexei Navalny, whom they describe as an opposition leader, was killed by dart frog poison. And they acknowledge that this isn't something that's produced within Russia, and it can't be generated from frogs held in captivity. So according to their theory, the Russians sent some person or persons to wherever the habitat for dart frogs is, I think it's South America, and extracted this poison and brought it back to Russia and killed Navalny while he was in captivity in a Russian prison pursuant to a conviction by a Russian court for various criminal offenses. As the author of this wonderful book about the Novichok, the poison that fooled the world, what's your take on this, John?
Well, it's an interesting take, and it's a repeat British operation. Here's why. First of all, you don't have to go to the Ecuadorian jungle to collect these beautifully colored little frogs and take off their skins and then analyze them, because some are not poisonous. The epibutadine is the name of the poison. It's been synthesized without froggy for since the 1980s. Okay.
So they got that wrong in their statement.
No. You, without boring the pants off, since we're at the laughter section of this podcast, of our audience, I have to say, look, if you look very carefully at the joint statement signed by the UK, France, Germany, the Netherlands, and Sweden, you look very carefully, you see that they don't exactly say. They say that what exactly killed Navalny, what caused his death. They don't exactly say that the Russians did it. They certainly don't say they've got the evidence. They refer in a very vague way, in the same way the British government started the Novichok story. And it basically, a couple of quick, so that we don't bore everybody. A colleague of mine, Mats Nilsson, an attorney in Stockholm, has pursued freedom of information litigation against the Swedish government to determine why they signed the joint statement. Did a Swedish government biowarfare laboratory, they've got a very good one, and it participated back in 2020 in analyzing Navalny's samples, blood samples, urine samples, hair samples, when he was in the Berlin clinic recovering from alleged Novichok poisoning. The Swedish lab has the capability, but Mats Nilsson has been able to show, and I've just published all the emails, that there is no Swedish laboratory check of anything, any fact about epibutadine or Navalny's post-mortem tissues or the laboratory tests which have been done. In other words, Sweden doesn't know directly what it said it believed in its statement. So just as you said, Dimitri, where are the labs that did the analysis? Answer, Yulia Navalnaya said last September that the labs had gone into operation immediately after Navalny died. That's 2 years ago, February 2024. The tissue samples have not been identified, but they are almost certainly hair cut from his head when after his body was released by the Russian authorities, after the Russians did a post-mortem, presented the results. to Lyudmila Navalny, his mother. By the way, Lyudmila Navalny and Yulia Navalny don't get along very well, and they are potential competitors in the succession to Navalny's political fortune and his political value to the intelligence services of several states. But leave that part aside. The tissues were under investigation abroad starting in 2024. Last September, Yulia Navalny made a 15-minute video in which she called on journalists of the world to investigate the results and have the results of the lab tests published. She didn't name the labs. She called on the journalists of the world to get the results published. Well, nobody heeded her call. There is, in fact, no publication of any lab. There's, in fact, no publication of any evidence at all. No publication at all. So my own hunch, my own hypothesis is that it was Porton Down, the British chemical warfare laboratory, which is one of a dozen sites that have synthesized epibutadine since the 1990s. There are probably more than a dozen countries and more than a dozen biowarfare laboratories around the world that have had stocks of this stuff. In fact, if you look at the open scientific literature, the Russians came late to epibutadine compared to the British and the Americans. Okay, so this is basically a news story. It's more interesting, I suppose, having a colorful frog than talking about the inside of Alexei Navalny's underpants, which was the last kind of concoction that the Navalny family came up with to explain his poisoning. What's happening here is that 4 of the states, Sweden, Germany, France, and the Netherlands, decided to endorse a British idea. Let's come up with a new one. Froggy Chock, not Novichok, Froggy Chock. And that gives everybody about a week of entertainment in the sense that the mainstream media need to keep people focused on hating Russia. That's it.
Well, since we're trying to end this on an entertaining note, I'll just add that when I heard of this dart frog poison, I immediately thought of these characters, and the attempt to make the Russians seem as though they're incredibly clever and sinister and treacherous, with some elaborate theory about how Navalny died. As you may know, John, I'm sure you know this, that weeks after he died, Kirill Budanov, the head of Ukrainian military intelligence, said that he died of natural causes.
A stroke. Yes, yes, Budanov did say that. Mm-hmm. Well, look at your logo. If I'm not mistaken, that's a wise owl. And don't owls eat frogs from if they can get them? You're frog averse. This resistance journalism is frog averse, but we're all Porton Down averse too.
Right.
This is a British operation in which the other states signed on because it's all in their interest to keep up this sort of public hatred of Russia, to keep funding the war. As best I can tell, that's it. But if people want to look at the details, minus the laughs, take a look at the last couple of Dances with Bears.
Absolutely. And I think I want to just, we're not going to have time to cover it today, but your article entitled, I think it's the STD problem. You're not talking in that article about sexually transmitted diseases, but rather something else, specifically,
Session testing day. Russia has its midterm problem, just like Trump does.
Exactly. And you've noted in that article, and I recommend people read it because we don't have time to deal with it today, that there has been a significant decline, apparently, in public support for the Russian government, Vladimir Putin, in recent weeks. And, obviously this may affect Russia's approach to resolving the Ukraine war. But in any case, we'll hopefully have time to discuss that later on. And by the way, John, where can people find your work? Please remind them about that.
Where? You mean apart from here? Okay.
I mean, I was referring to your Dances with Bears website.
Oh, well, yeah, it's johnhelmer.net.
Okay. Thank you very much, John, and I look forward to our next discussion. We're signing off today on February 27, 2026.
Thank you, Dimitri.